Hello and welcome to this edition of The Deep Dive Perspective, a show in which we try to get to the bottom of all sorts of issues which concern our everyday lives. But we do it with an eye on the establishment narratives as well as counter-narratives that exist. Today's topic we're going to tackle is something which we're all very familiar with: money, the nature of money. What is it for? What is it about? How did it emerge? How does it impact our lives? We assume that we know, and it's something that I've assumed, it's just something you have. It's transactions we do every day. But there's more to it, I'm told. And today we have in the studio with us Clive Menzies. Welcome, Clive.
Hello. It's good to be here.
It's lovely to have you here again. And you talk about money in the context of the way our systems operate and how crucial it is. And I think we're going to unpack that in this program, because the economic illiteracy is what concerns me in terms of society at large. My own economic illiteracy, I can own up to that, to understand the systems which run our lives, whether it's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or whether it's the markets, the City of London, Wall Street, whether it's the mechanisms behind those, or whether it's the actual system of capitalism or alternative systems. The reality is, Clive, that most people are pretty ignorant. What all they want to do is just be able to have money and enough of it to be able to survive and get on with their lives. That's the concern that most people have. And unfortunately, there's never seems to be enough money for most of us, and there are good reasons, no doubt you're going to tell me as to why. But I think, first of all, let's open with the question of what is money? What is it for? In your view, the average person's view may be something different.
Okay. I think to assuage your fears, I think economic illiteracy is probably a virtue rather than a flaw, because I think economics is just a distraction from the reality, because economics seldom, or if ever, addresses money and its fundamental nature and consequences. So I'm not going to talk in economic spiel, you'll be relieved to hear, because it is exactly that. It's illusory in terms of the way it's described. So what is money and what is it for? Money is the way we organize ourselves as a species, and we have done for about 3,000 to 5,000 years. And arguably it may go back further than that, but in terms of organizing at scale, that seems to be the sort of benchmark. Whereas we as modern humans have probably been around for approaching 300,000 years. So how did we operate before the adoption of money? And essentially, contrary to claims by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations and others, we did not live by barter. Barter may have happened, but it was not the basis of how we organized ourselves. And the best analogy that I can use is how we organize ourselves within families. Obviously, families need money to access things from outside, but talking about the relationships within families and small groups, even today, I mean, it's how we operate. We don't use money. We understand the subtle, unique attributes of everyone. So from the very youngest to the elderly, to the dysfunctional, the highly effective, we understand each person's unique attributes, and we understand the relationships, and everybody gets looked after within the family. And obviously that is affected by the external influence of money, but I'm not talking about that. That is something separate. So before the adoption of money, that's how we lived. And you could probably reckon that a group could grow to 150 odd people, and that dynamic was still workable. One was capable of maintaining 150 sort of close relationships and a complex understanding of all of those individuals concerned. Once you move beyond that, in other words, if you want to deal with someone outside the community, or you're looking to create something of scale, and a lot of this draws on archaeological and anthropological research rather than economic research, if you like. Once you went beyond that, you needed a way of being able to develop some form of trust between a stranger and yourself. And so the adoption of money was quite convenient because there would be this notional, whether it be shells, Virginia tobacco was currency. I mean, there'd be so many different forms of money. But let's say gold, for example, if one could agree on the value of gold, that what its value was in terms of what you could acquire or what you needed, then you didn't need to understand the other party's situation. You just both had to agree that the value of the gold was acceptable to both. And that value was attributed either by an authority or by mutual agreement or whatever. So money was a very useful mechanism to enable us to scale up our activities. And it was probably often used by armies, because when they didn't rape and pillage their way across a territory to go to war, they would use money to replenish the troops and all the rest of it, and pay the troops as well. So money has been a very useful mechanism, but with it comes a huge number of problems because you don't really have a true understanding in any given transaction. You don't have an understanding of the unique attributes of that transaction. And so what has happened progressively, particularly under the modern financial system, is that money has become the object of value rather than a representation of value. It's a proxy for value which bears no relationship to what is important to us as human beings to satisfy our needs and our evolution as a species.
So how has that happened? How has money changed from that point you were describing as a useful thing in terms of gold and exchanging things and buying things?
Well, it's always been...
How's it changed?
It's always been problematical. And even before money, when they used sort of debt, people would have their family taken away as payment for debts and what have you. There would be regular jubilees to reset the system, and slaves would be sent back to their families, and because it is a system that gets out of balance very quickly, and typically 7-year jubilees were, but latterly we've not seen that. But I would say really with the beginning of banking, and you could probably date that back to 1684, the establishment of the Bank of England.
Yes.
I mean, banking had obviously predated that, but that was really the sort of hegemonic start of banking. And then the Federal Reserve in 1913. And then through the latter half of the 20th century, the financialization of more and more. So families, communities, villages could often live without money among themselves, but through the Industrial Revolution and enclosures where people were denied more and more access to the means to life, then money became much more important, much more central to your existence. And with money markets, stock markets, money itself fluctuating in value and being, if you like, a gambling mechanism almost, in which, and we can talk about the mechanics of interest and how that is a wealth transfer mechanism which transfers money from those who have too little to those who have more than they can ever spend in terms of what they need. So money has become central to the way we organise ourselves progressively over centuries, but I would say it is accelerated out of all proportion probably since the beginning of the 20th century. And in being a proxy, and a very clumsy proxy for value. And we talked in our previous programme about, you know, our perception of value and entertainment and all of these things, but it's because we've been disassociated from real value, that we don't handle value directly in terms of the unique attributes.
Explain that idea of value and its relation to money in particular.
Well, in the work that we've been doing on money, we tried to get to the nub of the question that you asked. What is value? And essentially value is where a need or a capacity meet. In other words, somebody has a need, somebody has a capacity to fulfill that need, and when they're brought together, value is created. So essentially there are two components to value. And our current system places no value on need. Those in need are, you know, they're not worth anything in monetary terms. Those who have capacity have the value.
Right.
So that's the first problem with money.
It's a question of justice.
Well, it's a question of logic, and it's a question of being in tune with universal law. That the universe runs on love, and once you create this distinction between, or you disassociate need and capacity and put value on one and not on the other, you're creating this competitive, divisive, destructive mechanism.
Well, I see that within the way establishment or the economic establishment or the political establishment seems to weigh up value and through money. There doesn't seem to be any value placed on charitable work or voluntary work, which often is actually a far bigger part of the GDP potentially, but actually economics and the system only seems to want to look at what actually produces profit or produces what they consider to be value. Is that an example of the kind of the?
I would say that charity is a product of this phenomenon of money, and it shouldn't exist. I would say a much better question to ask is, what is the value of motherhood for the human race, for the human evolution? What is the value of motherhood?
It's priceless.
It's a primary value.
Yeah.
And yet, what monetary value is placed in Russia? They put value on motherhood. They actually give money to people who produce children.
And here, actually, mothers are largely discriminated against.
Yeah. So, you know, what is the value of a wife, a supportive wife in a relationship? You know, all of what is fundamental to our being? It is family. Without family, there is no human society, unless you want to go into the dystopia of manufactured embryos and, you know, the sort of Matrix, as in the film, dystopia, where we're just physically farmed as cattle, literally.
Sure.
So, you know, as individual living, sentient, conscious beings, what is important to us? It's our families. It's those we love. And when I say family, I don't just mean blood family. I mean the human family.
Okay.
Because we're all related. We're all connected. Our futures are all inextricably intertwined. So what money has done is divided us from what is really of value to us as living, breathing men, women, boys and girls. And that is why we've got this dystopia of, 97 sexes or whatever the current number is. I have no idea. But, you take anyone who's not been through any sort of woke education, you say, how many sexes are there? It's logical. One's got a penis, one's got a vagina, and they reproduce, and that's how we exist. But this ideological sort of division, either on colour, race, sex, sexual orientation, all of these isms, if you like, or identities, are created to divide us from the reality, and money is underpinning all of these.
So money, the primary printers of money are the state now.
No.
That's what the general perception
Definitely
is.
not.
But that was what I was going to come on to, is that in reality this is another illusion. So I want to talk about the way money is produced and how it then actually is used or manipulated, perhaps is a better word, by those who have it.
Okay, let's talk about the mechanics of money, because I think it's quite important. There's a very good book that we drew on early on in our work at Critical Thinking called Interest and Inflation-Free Money by Margaret Kennedy, who unfortunately passed away not long after I'd had correspondence with her and what have you. And I think there's a few interviews with her, with various people. But basically, she laid out in a very short, accessible booklet some fairly fundamental truth, such as the debt always grows faster than our ability to repay the debt. This is why we need a reset. And interest on money, basically, people who don't have enough money have to borrow it. And so they end up paying interest. And she did this, I think she did her study, and I can't remember the exact period, but it was between the late 60s and early 80s, I think, over a period. She analysed the amount of money in Western Germany, so before unification of Germany, when financialisation, we talked about financialisation being progressive. Well, back in the 1970s, financialisation hadn't really taken off, and it certainly wasn't prevalent in West Germany. But she analysed the German population by income in terms of the amount of interest they paid and received. And the bottom 80% paid twice as much interest as they received. And the 10% between 80 and 90% broke even. And the top 10% received twice as much money as they paid, interest as they paid. So all of the 80%'s interest was going to the top 10%.
Right.
And when you took it out, I can't remember the exact figures, but the top 1% got something like 15 times what the top 10% got, and then the top 0.1% got 2,000 times. So there's this progressive driving up of money, which is a poor representation of wealth, but it's the one that we've used, that drives it up the pyramid, as it were. So in terms of money, what it does, it's a highly abusive mechanism for most people. And there was another point I was going to make. Could you just elaborate on your question?
I just wanted to really get to the state and its relationship and the printing of money, because there's no...
that's where I hadn't got to. Margaret Kennedy covers a couple of other aspects which I won't go into. But there was a movement around the time of Occupy called positive money. And that has an interesting history, because that's now gone totally net zero. But it did some very good work in analysing where money comes from. And it put out this paper that explained that the money that we physically use is about 3% of total money, and the rest is all created by private bank debt. So how does that happen? So you, Mosin, want to buy yourself a shiny new Ferrari, because that's a symbol of success in today's society. So you go along to your bank, and because you earn a reasonable salary, they say, yes, we'll lend you 100,000 for the latest Testarossa or whatever it may be. Just sign on this piece of paper. It is your signature on that piece of paper that creates the money. It's not the bank. The bank hasn't got £100,000 in notes sitting there to give to you.
I see.
Basically, that piece of paper then becomes a tradable security that goes into the nefarious money markets, and it can be traded several times over. So that 100,000 actually gets traded for more money. But essentially, you created that money, and yet you have to pay it back. So you create it, and you still have to find money from somewhere to repay that. And then to add insult to injury, and if we're talking about houses rather than cars, you not only have to pay the original amount you borrowed, so let's say you bought a house for £100,000, you have to pay something like 2.5 times that amount on top, just as interest. And yet the interest is never created. So it creates a Hunger Games economy, because they create the debt, but they don't create the interest. So they're constantly drawing more money out of the system to pay the interest. So people are increasingly fighting for a reducing share of money. And this is why they have to create new forms of debt. So if we go back to student debt, we did an analysis, because it came in around the time that critical thinking started, that showed that they were attempting to plug a £3 billion hole, alleged hole. I mean, basically investing in education, irrespective that education is flawed, but investing in education is creating value for society. But the idea was, I think it was Tony Blair said, why should those who go to university be privileged and not pay for it? They ought to pay it back when they get these high-paid jobs, which is another lie, but that's in terms of the high-paid jobs. But that 3 billion quickly morphed into 14 billion hole. So there is student accommodation. Huge amounts of money is being poured into investment in student accommodation to, harvest the cattle, draw more money. So debt is the mechanism that drives the money system. And unless the debt keeps growing, the system falls over, which is why you need a reset, which is why there's all this talk about the Great Reset from the World Economic Forum, and they're trying to use central bank digital currency as a way of somehow finessing some sort of transition to the future. But they're not looking at the methodology. It's the methodology that's flawed.
Where it seems to, one of the areas that I've studied which hints at the latest iteration of how money is manipulated or controlled by a very small elite, it seems, was of course in America when the Fed gets set up. And then there's a point where Richard Nixon does away with gold as a standard sort of
off the gold standard.
Yeah, off the gold standard. And then we have the opening up of
so do you want me to go through that history?
For people to understand the process is very important, and then how they've lost control of basically any semblance of sanity around money.
Well, we could go back to the Bank of England, but let's go back to the American Revolution, the American War of Independence. It wasn't about tea. It was about the colonies wanting to create their own money.
Okay.
That was what the War of Independence was around. And arguably Lincoln was assassinated because he started issuing greenbacks, state-produced money. You said earlier, earlier, the state produces money or creates the money. It doesn't. But when it does create the money, the bankers don't like that, and that ends up in some sort of war or somebody being assassinated, like John F. Kennedy, who was trying to do something similar. And I'll tell you the story of Guernsey, because that's quite the Guernsey experiment. There's an essay, I think his name is by somebody called Michael Jordan, which I've referenced quite a lot. In essence, after the Napoleonic Wars, Guernsey's economy was on its knees. So this is around 1820, I think. And because Guernsey was a British or English protectorate at the time, they had a High Commissioner or Governor who was appointed by the UK government or the British government. But they were self-governing by a group called the States of Guernsey, and this was like a mini parliament. Anyway, they went along to the governor and they said, we've got a real problem because we've got no money. And, you know, the infrastructure is failing, we've got no commerce, people are starving, all the rest of it. So he said, well, do you have labour, men? And they said, yes. Do you have materials to build things? Yes. So what's the problem? Well, we have no money, because the banks were busy profiteering from the Napoleonic Wars and the aftermath and all the rest of it, and they weren't interested in Guernsey. There was no money to be made there because the economy wasn't. So he said, well, why not create your own? And they did. And they created the Guernsey pound, spending it into the economy. And within 2.5 years, they created a market, they'd repaired the infrastructure, and a decade later, the Guernsey economy was so vibrant that the banks wanted to come back in, and they did, and they stopped the issuance of any further Guernsey pounds. So although Guernsey pounds still exist, they've never increased since then. And Guernsey is now an offshore financial centre, and that's a whole other story. So the creation of money is what gives power. And this is why money rules the world, because they control, through the Bank of International Settlements, they control central banks. The Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, is the central banker's bank. And I won't go into the sort of complexities of that, but the Federal Reserve the Federal Reserve is slightly different because it comprises 12 regional banks, but they have a Federal Reserve Board, and that's their central bank. The Bank of England is our central bank, but they all are, if you like, accountable to the Bank of International Settlements, which has total immunity from anything, irrespective of what central bank immunity there is. The Bank of International Settlements is.
And who owns the Bank of International Settlements?
Well, it's difficult to prove, but effectively the banking families control the Bank of International. I mean, when they create these organisations like the IMF, the World Bank, the Bank of International Settlements, all of these. When the Bank of England was created, I think they were supposed to put up something like 8 million in gold. I think they barely put up 2 million, and the rest was all created out of sophistry. And one can reckon that most of these organisations are the same way. And we've talked a bit about climate change in the past, and I think it's worth touching on the role of Rothschilds and money in the climate change narrative. In 1992, there was an UNCED conference, spelt UNCED. The UN is a bankster-created organisation, but UNCED is quite interesting.
Yeah, the World Bank is part of the UN. It's an extension.
Well, it's part of the banking mafia's levers of power. So at this conference, it was declared there was Edmund de Rothschild, David Rockefeller, Maurice Strong, who was an oil man, and people think that the oil companies are the bogeymen in the climate narrative, but they're behind it. And basically what they said was that they would create a Rothschild bank to handle all the carbon credits. In other words, to harvest the human cattle. We're the carbon they want to reduce, but that's a whole other narrative.
Another conversation.
So the whole mechanism of banking, it's a criminal enterprise, effectively. There's no such thing as ethical banking. Islamic banking is as criminal as the rest of them. It's sophistry. It's not.
They play with words, but actually it's the same system.
They bribe a few mullahs to sign off on their articles of association. But banking is a criminal enterprise. It's a parasitic, blood-sucking leech on humanity. There's a Rolling Stone article written by Matt Taibbi years ago called the Great Bubble Machine or something. I can't remember. And the opening line is about this blood-sucking funnel that just sucks money out of everything. I mean, I can't remember the exact words, but it's well worth reading. It's
Are states now beholden to this blood-sucking?
Of course.
Is it the richest countries in the world, the US, you could put that, China, Britain among them?
All of them.
Are any of them truly then independent, sovereign nations? If
Libya was.
Yeah, so was...
Look what happened to Gaddafi.
Syria wasn't in debt. It was also not linked to the World Bank. And that brings in...
Arguably, Russia is less in hock to money power than most. And, you've seen how they've been alienated. But the Chinese were infiltrated by the Rothschilds, and, Mao was put in power by the same forces that put Lenin in power and what have you. So money, politics is theatre. And money rules. That's essentially the lesson that people have to learn. And people get excited about Trump, Biden, this, that, and that. And, Trump is going to clean the swamp. Well, fool me once. He didn't do it in 2016. Didn't do it before he left office. He executed Operation Warp Speed to vaccinate the population under a military dictatorship. So, these are theatre.
It brings into mind, if money power, the money mafia institutions are that wealthy, that powerful, and we can bring in the likes of BlackRock, State Street, and
they're
others.
all owned by the same people.
Yeah. When we look at the origins, they all seem to head in the same pyramidic direction.
They're all interconnected.
So, given that's the case, when we're told to look at geopolitics, and when we're told by the news or politicians to gravitate towards the political mechanisms as the source of all policy making, all woes, all good, are we making a mistake? Is actually are we being pushed left of centre in terms of?
Have you seen The Wizard of Oz?
Yes.
The man behind the curtain.
Yes. So it's the same kind of scenario.
It's an illusion. It's an illusion. The business, arguably, when I think about Occupy, because in retrospect, I think Occupy was equally controlled by similar forces. When I look back at the way they managed consensus, I was not the most popular person in the camp when I started talking about 9/11 or climate change.
Well, let me just pause there, because the Occupy or any other what could be described as deep state operation is viable if this money is in the hands of institutions which are not state related. So that means they've got an extraordinary amount of power to create their own institutions, their own bodies. They could have their own intelligence agencies. They could presumably have their own
the money
armies.
Power?
Yes.
Well, where do you think intelligence agencies started from? Nathan Rothschild. I mean, this is not the first instance, but it's an emblematic example. Nathan Rothschild, his father, Mayer Rothschild, or Bauer, as they were formerly known, sent his 5 sons to various capitals around the world. And Nathan Rothschild was in London. And the Napoleonic Wars and the Battle of Waterloo there was a sophisticated network of spies and information. Banking thrives on information and having information prior to anyone else. And the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo was going to determine a whole load of things for the future of us all, particularly in England. And Rothschilds, through his agents, knew the result before, probably about 24 hours before anybody else. So, and he went on the floor of the stock exchange looking very miserable, and using agents and representatives started selling government stock and caused a panic. And everybody saw Nathan Rothschild, wasn't very happy. Clearly we'd lost the war and things were dire. Everybody was selling Britain. So they sold everything down and there was a panic. And then his agents secretly brought everything back for pennies on the pound. And they've done it time and time again. But this was a fairly primary example of how it happened. So basically by then, if they hadn't owned England with the establishment of the Bank of England, by 1815 they were fully in control of everything. So they do own everything.
Okay, let's give a practical example of this so people don't just think this is kind of airy-fairy, pie-in-the-sky stuff. The City of London exists. The Corporation of London is a known body, fact. It has a Lord Mayor, which is different from the Mayor of London. Which
state within a state.
Yeah, a state within a state. It's essentially an onshore tax haven.
For the rest of the world.
For the rest of the world. The British government doesn't have necessary jurisdiction over what goes on in their financial sphere.
Have no power.
So to all intents and purposes, studying the relationship between the Corporation of London and the Crown, or the British state here, is perhaps a good model for us to be able to get an inkling of what might be happening in the rest of the world to prove what you've just been sort of analysing. I mean, what's the relationship between these two entities?
I think you could probably get someone on far more conversant with the detail of this than myself, but I will attempt to give you a flavour of what I've learned.
Sure.
I mean, essentially, this dates back centuries, and it dates back or even thousands of years to the Chaldeans, the Phoenicians, then the Venetians, and then Northern Europe, and eventually the Bank of England, and the establishment of the City of London. And it's to do with the Templars and symbology, so the temple and the law, that's all part of the same matrix of power. And it's quite complicated, and I don't think I'm qualified to unpack it completely. So you mentioned democracy in our previous conversation, and it's quite interesting and quite illustrative, the relationship between our democracy, Houses of Parliament, and the City of London.
Sure.
The City of London has somebody called the Remembrancer who sits behind or next to the Speaker, and to ensure that no legislation ever passes to prejudice the interests of the City of London. So that is where the power lies. The Queen, as she was, because I don't have much faith that Charlie is really a king. There are a whole number of reasons why he's not a real king. But the Queen always had to ask permission to enter the City of London.
Right.
It is a bit like the Vatican and Washington, D.C., it's a state within a state. And this dates back to Unum Sanctum in the 1300s in Rome. It dates back to the Sestui KV Act in 1666 in this country after the Great Fire of London. I mean, there are many strands to this relationship that would take a series of programs to unpack. Sure. And as I say, I think you can probably find far better people to explain elements of this and maybe get a picture of how it all fits together. But in essence, the City of London is a power within itself. It owns assets and land way beyond its borders. I mean, where I used to live in Crouch End, there was a lot of Corporation of London land. I'm sure many people who live around London know that there's corporation land around them. It's a very arcane establishment. And the thing about democracy is that in the old days, when a king died or was removed, the debts were forgiven and a reset occurred. The beauty of democracy is that the debts always remain intact. Nobody's debts are forgiven. The Treasury, so-called, is still on the hook for all the interests, which is why we're paying war loan from the 1700s. I think we're still paying it. It's not a treasury. It's the reverse of a treasury. It's a huge debt trap, our treasury.
And the debt of nations, I mean, America is today in debt to the tune of 31 trillion or something ridiculous like that.
Yeah,
Britain is 5 or 6 trillion now, and this is rapidly rising. But this is
why we're in crisis.
But who are they in debt to?
The banking system.
So it is these guys, Wall Street Incorporated. Basically,
we're now in the ridiculous position where they can just create money at will, and it gets harvested or laundered through Ukraine or through the NHS, through all the PPE and the drugs and so they buy. Politicians are cheap. You don't have to. It costs nothing to buy a politician.
They're all on between 150,000 and 300,000 a year. So
but they become greedy. I was going to swear at that point, but I won't. but they become greedy so-and-sos. And having worked in the city, I can understand the psychology of thinking that you're not being paid enough for what you're doing, because in the context of what I was doing, I felt I was creating huge value. And although I was probably in the top 5% of earners in the UK, I felt they weren't paying me enough. And it's quite easy to get into that mindset.
Because you're seeing the level of finance that is going through their coffers, I
guess.
You
know what they're generating. You know what your bosses are, you don't know what they're earning, but you have a sense of the order of magnitude. So you think, well, I want more. So I can understand the psychology of it.
So we've discussed some of the origins, the history, and the nature of money. As far as its impact on the ordinary person today, what we do know is that words like inflation are being thrown around. We're in austerity. This is another common word.
More austerity.
Where we talk about the whole economic meltdown and collapse. Some people are talking about that. The rising cost of living. These are the things which actually affect ordinary people. And a small interest rise will squeeze people's incomes, and it actually literally dictates how people live and what they can and can't do. Now, that is directly related there to those bodies we just talked about. What power do ordinary people have in a democracy to be able to shift that balance? Because it doesn't seem to me as though the Corporation of London is necessarily in the business of working for the interests of the people. As you said right at the beginning, that the purpose of their money or that system is not to
power control.
Yeah. So how does the ordinary person change that?
Well, contrary to what the cattle are incentivized to do, want more, want less money, and starve the system of its lifeblood, which is interest, debt, rents, fines, ULEZ charges, all the nonsense that we get harvested. You see billboards, charities. You mentioned charities. They are equally scams to harvest the cattle. The amount of money that goes to the causes, particularly the big ones, there may be, and it's complex because there are well-meaning people who are actually doing good on the ground for those charities. And I'm not dismissing them, but they're working within a structure that is harvesting It's like
They're
lotteries.
corporations as well.
Don't buy lottery tickets. I ran a lottery for a while in one of my manifestations, and it's a no-brainer. You basically you collect all this money, you allocate 50% in prizes, and it costs you about 20% to run the thing with technology today, and the rest is all profit. And, employing these poor young people on the street to buttonhole people and get them to sign up for regular contributions to this charity or that charity or stop knife crime or whatever it may be. It's all harvesting the energy and the resources of the human cattle.
What about this withdrawal of consent that you're proposing? Would it not collapse the system? Would that not make it even worse for the ordinary Joe? That if he collapses the system, then where's he going to get his food, and how's he going to?
Well, there's a war on food at the moment. I mean, farmers are being targeted. Never mind the inheritance tax; that's almost a diversion. There's been a constant assault on the quality and quantity of our food. Farmers are being incentivized not to grow food, to destroy crops, and they're being squeezed in many ways. And the retail giants are culpable in a huge way.
Sure.
But what is happening at a grassroots level, and I'm involved in groups that are looking at alternative food networks, cooperatives, working with farmers directly, cutting out the supermarkets, health. Similarly, people are looking to look after their own health. So just stop paying for the things you don't need to pay for. And withdraw your consent, refuse to comply. If they come back with another bird flu, monkeypox, whatever it may be, don't pay any attention. When they say masks are mandated or standing, that's an invitation for you to comply. You just say no.
Well, going back to the question I raised right in my introduction was really the ignorance or the illiteracy, the economic literacy, now becomes even more glaringly dangerous the more you've described this system, because without an understanding, the basic understanding of economics or about money or about the politics of money, we don't stand a chance. I mean, withdrawing consent is not an option for somebody who is completely economically ignorant. I mean, they wouldn't know why they would have to do that and how that would change. So,
well, except that, if you look at energy costs, and that's a whole other debate, the Russian sanctions were economic suicide by Britain and Europe.
Yep.
I mean, I and others saw that coming.
Yeah, that was not in the interest of the people. That was some sort of other agenda.
The energy belongs to us.
Yeah. The commons, yeah.
It's part of the commons. They are selling us back what we own in the same way that they're selling us back everything that we own. The collective wealth of the country belongs to all the people within it, and that is being harvested and rationed. And we need to, I put together a sort of article called The Strategy for Resistance. This was around the time of the Yellow Vest
regarding make that work regarding money as our last salvo, as to how that resistance using
it's getting into the mindset of needing less, and that is an attitudinal thing. So it's not using credit cards, not using loyalty cards. Going to the supermarket, if you got a Waitrose card or a
what will that
Tesco,
result in?
Basically, you're denying the system data, because data is the new value. And that is what is being harvested by Amazon, Facebook, eBay, Apple, Microsoft. That is where the value is. That's the value of the new way that we're going to organize ourselves. And that value is being extracted through all the information that we give in exchange for discounts or preferential treatment. So rather than, it's an attitudinal change of doing with less, doing with what you need rather than, and that means buying higher quality food, but less of it, because most of us buy too much food and waste food, and we buy food that isn't food. So buy less food, but buy higher quality food, and do without the things we don't need.
And the reaction from those who are in power, who control that money, what would that be to something?
Well, basically, you're beginning to draw. We are the power of the system.
Right.
Without us, the system doesn't operate. So the more, every individual has their own unique circumstances, and they can do some things, can't do others. You know, I'm very lucky. I have very little to lose these days. So I've withdrawn more and more from the system because I don't have anything they can take from me. I don't have a house. I don't have money. I don't have anything really. But I work on trying to do with less. And I'm part of communities, loving communities that love and support each other, by which I can survive. So I'm very privileged in that sense. But, you know, going back 3 or 4, 10 years, when I started on this journey of trying to withdraw consent, it was gradual steps. I stopped using loyalty cards and credit cards almost immediately. So I haven't used those for... So it's a progressive thing, but it's much more psychological and attitudinal. That recognizing that money is the trap,
right,
and that we need to organize ourselves on universal principles, which is based on love.
Thank you very much, Clive. An absolutely fascinating discussion. We could go on more, because even just in that last kind of output that to my last question Clive gave, there are so many things to explore. But you'll get an idea of just how potentially dark modern day slavery is, because it seems like debt, or the mortgage, the death grip that is maintained on most of us in this society, clearly creates misery. Clearly poverty isn't something that's been eradicated. It's very much a man-made thing. Quite clearly, those in power with money, or the ones who create that money, don't seem to be terribly concerned of solving many of the problems which you and I would think it's logically a priority for it to be done. More to be broken down on this on future programs, no doubt. A real countercultural, counter-political, counter-economic narrative that we've heard today around money. Do like, share and subscribe to the channel. Until the next Deep Dive Perspective show, goodbye.